Good morning, and we got a small group today, but we got a few people online as well, and exciting to be just back in person. So we kind of wanted to ease into it, so we kept this a smaller, restricted event just to get a few people together, and so it's great to see you guys, and excited to get back to a little bit more to normal here. So I met most of you, but I'm Steve Klein. I'm the president and CEO of Minnesota Precision Manufacturing Association-MPMA. And I come from industry for 20 years prior to this, and then I've been a part of MPMA all those years, and been working with LB Carlson for pretty much my whole life, I guess. Yeah. So I don't know, most of those, for the better part of 30 years. So, but excited to have you here today. Just some well, I guess a couple things I want to mention. So, going forward, basically, we intend that all MPMA events are going to be hybrid, I guess, to some extent going forward. We're a statewide association, but usually most of our programs are just most in the Twin Cities. We'll do a couple out of state, but we have enough members that are out of state. We want to try and accommodate. So even like the technology mills, got a little microphone on today, not for audio here, but just so that people can chime in from anywhere and listen in and learn. So we'll try that out, and we'll start seeing more events too. That might be, I think we'll do a tour in Mankato, and maybe we'll start spreading out a little bit. That way, the people in the Twin Cities could still chime in, even if they can't drive to the location. So, but some upcoming things too. Next week, Thursday, right, the 7th. Yeah, a week from today, we've got our first kind of social event at the Lookout Bar and Grill, right, in Maple Grove. So, got a decent group signed up for that already. There's still a couple days to sign up, and so again, we're keeping that restricted to like 30 people. But live music, food, and so it should be a good time. And then otherwise, you guys can just check our website too for a lot of other upcoming events. We basically have a couple every month, and then at least a couple every month. And then our golf outing is filling up fast, so it's July 27th. I think we sold all the sponsorships right away, and then the golfers, and we're about 65% full. Almost over a month and a half to go. So people are really excited to get out and see people. So. But today's program, I actually sat in on this program. I don't know how many years ago it was, but
3-4 years ago, maybe.
Oh, more than that.
Maybe more than that. Yeah.
I've been with the MPMA officially for 3 years, and I bet it was a couple years before that. So it's probably 5 years of that. But it's a great presentation. Like I said, I've known Mel for better part of 30 years, and I'll just say that Mel's been with LB Carlson for longer than that. And
yes, I have.
And I have a lot of respect for Mel. He's very knowledgeable on not only accounting practices, but how it applies to the industry and operationally. So this is a great presentation on kind of applying, accounting principles, but more in an operational standpoint, how to manage business. So I think it's a great presentation. Looking forward to it. So I guess I'll just hand it over to Mel.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. Appreciate that. I think I'm supposed to stand right here. What can I move around? Yeah, I like to move around, but I'll try to stay put as the best I can. Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. Appreciate that. It's kind of fun to actually do one of these again live. We've done a lot of Zoom meetings and webinars, so good to be back in front of people. Little background on this topic, planning for profits on what you have. I first did this back in 2014. It was somebody asked me to do a webinar, and I said, on what? And they said, anything you want. So I thought about it a while, and this was something that is kind of a pet peeve of mine. Not pet peeve, but I hear it a lot with companies as we're working with them about if they're not making adequate profitability. It always came back to we don't have enough sales. And I've always had the mindset that you probably do have enough sales to make a profit. We still want you to try to grow. But so that's what this seminar is about, the background on it. And I've given it several times in the past 6-7 years to groups like this, associations, but also individual companies. And it's fun to do. Of all the topics I've done over the years, this one I enjoy the most. So I hope you do as well. Yeah, I'm going to probably click ahead, Lacey, if you could. This is just an outline. By the way, everybody's got a handout so they can follow along too. But this is what we're going to try to cover today. I don't have to really walk through this. I am going to give some examples too. By the way, there's a lot of material here, and it's hard to get through everything in an hour. So if you want to circle back with any questions, feel free. If people are online, they can chat in questions, I imagine, and hopefully we'll have time at the end to address them. If not, I can address them later as well. Next. So this slide here, I actually start every presentation off with this slide, no matter what the topic is. And it's just, for me, it's a reminder. I was taught this, I guess, 30 some years ago by my mentor. And he said, owners have two primary reasons to be in business, and owners and management have two primary responsibilities, and that's to make an adequate profit and to enhance the value of the business. Sounds kind of basic, but if you really think about it, I know it's kind of a cold statement too, that there's only two things that are important. I know a lot of people say, well, I went into business for a lot of reasons, but without these two things, the rest of it doesn't really matter because you won't probably be around. So I just like to remind people of that. Flip ahead there, Lacey. So some of the objectives, I just want to talk about what we're trying to do here today, okay? We'll get to more of this, but we've all heard, what gets tracked and given attention will improve. And obviously this doesn't guarantee success, but if you're not doing some of these things, I think you're doing that strategy of hope or just hoping things get better. And I'll just say from my perspective, you're not going to hear a magic answer here that's a magic formula, but the luxury I have that maybe that the rest of you don't is, and I'll never know your business as well as you do, so I don't pretend to either, or this industry. But I think what I maybe have that maybe you don't is I've been around this a long time, and I've seen inside hundreds of companies. And I've seen a lot of different things that you probably don't have the luxury of. I see that people feel like they're doing things well, and they are for the most part. They're good employees, but people get into routines and they don't like to change. And so I see a lot of things that work, and I see things that don't work. And that's kind of what I'm trying to convey here today. So I want you to keep an open mind as we're going through this, that consider that maybe you can do things differently or better. And maybe you can walk away with just a few things that you can bring back to your company and implement. At least think about going back and doing an assessment internally in your company of some of these things I've listed here. How you're doing your planning, short-term and long-term, how you're doing your reporting. I'm going to talk a lot about that. How you're using these tools. Employee involvement. I see this as one of the problems in a lot of companies is they're not getting their employees engaged enough because they're the ones who really have to carry out the initiatives, not management. How decisions are made, how things get implemented. And really the bottom line question to ask yourself is, are we as good as we think we are? And I'll be the first to raise my hand on this. I mean, we experience some of this in our own company that we get so busy, just like you do with your customers and getting jobs out the door, that sometimes you forget about what's going on inside your own company. And I'm just saying, step back from that a little bit. And we always say, the number one customer or client in your company should be yourself. And you should spend as much time on yourself and your business as you are thinking about satisfying your customers. So common theme, common mindset, common problem. So what am I talking about here? The common theme is inadequate profitability, okay? The common mindset is, and the common problem is, and I hear this over and over, is we need more sales. That's the problem. I hear it over and over again. So I just want you to, I'm going to walk through this, and I want to just ask you, does this sound familiar? Have you ever experienced this before? But because I can tell you we have. I mean, business is hard, right? You're battling throughout the year. You have some good months, some bad months. It's up and down. It always is. But somewhere along the year, you might experience a level of disappointment in profits. It happens all the time. And maybe not every year, but you've probably all experienced it. Then what happens during this period of disappointment, you know, you're halfway through the year, you get toward the end of the year, and what do most companies do? They start working on next year's plan and next year's projection. And I see this a lot. You start to build in some growth and you say, oh, we're going to grow 4%, 8%, whatever the number is. And you always feel like it's conservative. It's going to be easy to obtain. You tell your banker, you know, I think we're going to really hit 10 or 12%, but we're being conservative at 6. And what's happening is you start to feel better about yourself. You're not disappointed anymore because now profits are just around the corner. I mean, you kind of forget about the current year and you think, well, next year we're going to be profitable. What's happening though is it's hiding some of the problems. You're doing your projections and you've built in growth. Now you're making money because it says you are, and you kind of forget about the problems and you're really not addressing the initiatives you should. And I don't know if this is, and then you get into next year, of course, and you start to repeat that performance and you're disappointed again because you haven't fixed what needs to be fixed. I want to add something to this slide. By the way, I should have mentioned if anybody wants to stop me to ask a question, go ahead. I think I have to add the fact that what we've all been through the past year and a half with COVID and PPP monies and stimulus relief and employee retention credits, that those things too, what I've been seeing, they've been great, right? They've helped a lot of companies and saved a lot of companies, but it's been a little misleading that people were feeling pretty good. We've got cash in the bank. And by the way, last year for a lot of people turned out better than they thought. So couple that with PPP and everybody's thinking, well, we're doing okay. We don't have anything to fix, but you probably do. So I think this part of it's hiding more problems as well. Just a little bit more on this about, do you feel yourselves talking about the same problems in meetings? Again, it's something we've experienced. You sit in management meetings and you think, boy, we talked about this 3 months ago and we haven't fixed it yet. And it just something you just don't seem to get past. And there's a direct correlation, I think, behind some of the things I'm talking about. If you can implement them and actually execute some of these things, you won't get it all done, but I think a lot of people struggle with this. So, excuse me, a pretty bold statement I'm going to make here is that every company has enough sales to make a profit. At least that's my assumption every time I walk into a company. And let me try to explain that. I guess I've sat in too many of these meetings where we just need more sales is the line I hear. There are exceptions. I get that. I mean, a startup company doesn't have enough sales yet or something like that. But most companies that have been around a while, I truly believe this statement. And just to give you an example, I like to talk about some of my client examples. I won't mention any names, but I had a company a few years back. They were pretty big, 15, 16 million of annual business. And I'd sit in those meetings for 2 or 3 years in a row, and it was always, we need to get to 17 million before we can do well. And then they got to 16, and then it was like, oh no, we need to get to 17 or 18 million. You know, it was always something more. And I got tired of it. I just thought, wait a second here, there's lots of companies that would love to have 15 million sales. There's a lot of $8 million companies making money. So why aren't you making money here on 15 million? And so we tried to back up and dive a little deeper into it. I won't go through that whole story, but that's what I was hearing a lot is we don't have enough sales. And I hear it's a top line problem. We need more. As soon as we get more sales, everything will be fine. That's a quote I've heard over and over and over. And it was always next month, next year, whatever. By the way, I do believe this applies to all companies. I really do. So obviously companies that are losing money and and have some problems, even stagnant companies, but even profitable companies. You know, maybe you're making a profit, but it's not what I call adequate profits. And that's what this is about, is adequate profitability. So if you are a profitable company, you might have the mindset that we're doing fine, but you're probably leaving profits on the table. Important distinction I want to make here, because a lot of my clients have thought when I'm walking in the door and talking about these things, they think, oh, you're a consultant, you're going to start talking about cutting costs. And that's not what I'm talking about today at all. Okay. And I want to make this distinction. Cutting costs is something that's short-term. It's a short-term fix. I'm talking about controls of costs, management of costs, sustainability, and it's way different. There's a time when you do cut costs. Example would be a client of mine that was 40+ million in sales and doing well. Overnight, they lost their biggest customer. It was about 20% of their business. And I remember the number, it was 800,000 of sales per month went away overnight. Okay, that's a situation you got to cut costs. I mean, you got to go in there and fix things right away. So there's a big difference between that and what I'm trying to convey here today. Okay, why do some companies have problems making adequate profits on the sales they have? These are just some things I've seen over the years. These are what I think are the important things. There's lots of reasons, but you might think, well, Mel, what are you talking about here? Financial statements. Everybody has a financial statement, so why is that a problem? In terms of inadequate profits, it's because I've seen so many statements that aren't well done. I'm not saying the numbers are wrong, but they're hard to read, they're hard to interpret. It should be the starting point of everything. This is where you sit down and you ask the question, what should have happened to produce adequate profits? And if you can't pick up your financial statement in less than an hour, come up with a lot of observations and points to make, they're not designed well. And then more importantly, and I see this quite a bit too, they're not used. You know, it's the CFO spends a lot of time and they do a good job getting the financial statement out, and then they're off to the next month and no one's really using them. So I do think that's a fault. I'm going to talk about these things more later, so I don't want to get too carried away right now. Projections and budgets. What am I talking about here? Again, probably a lot of people have them, but this area in particular, I don't feel people do very well. No offense, but I've given 4-hour presentations before just on how to prepare projections and process, the process. But most importantly, again, they're underutilized. And by the way, this is something else I was taught a long time ago. This is your most important management tool in your whole company, your projections. Lack of emphasis on management reporting, which is really complements to these first two. Again, a lot more about that later. This next one's kind of important. Lack of communication and training of company plans and expectations, another common problem. You develop your projections and budget. Management decides what they want to do next year, but they're not conveying this and training their people and giving them the tools to do it. And I just think it's so unfair to feel like an employer, somebody's not doing their job or not helping to drive these numbers. But you got to remember, a lot of your employees have never been trained on things like this. They've been trained to do their job and they're good at it. But if you want them to drive some of these numbers, they need to know what the expectations are and how to do that and how to make it happen. And obviously lack of accountability and execution, and of course profits are left on the table. So these are just some of the common problems, and maybe you'll see a little more clearly as I'm going through this. I want, I've been talking a lot about things and theories and all that, and objectives. I want to get into an example so maybe you can see what I'm talking about. But before I do that, remember, this isn't a cost-cutting exercise. It's about controls. Again, cost-cutting is temporary. I'm talking about sustainability. And when you do this, just a word of caution, you start going into this, and it might feel a little overwhelming that if you start this process the way I think it should be done, you might go, oh my gosh, there's way too much to do here. And you might go back in and say, instead of fixing all these things, let's just grow ourselves out of this problem. Let's just focus on sales. That's a mistake. I still want you to grow. I want you to focus on sales, but that's not what's going to drive adequate profitability. So don't give in. Okay, so when you do dive into this, these first three are kind of obvious statements maybe, but I guess hear me through a little bit. This is where it gets overwhelming, and this is where don't get frustrated, but trying to identify what's critical, what needs to change, and what are the priorities. I don't think it's that hard, especially if your information is put together well. If I pick up a really good financial statement, I think I can make some observations and some questions and start diving into areas pretty quickly. So identifying what your issues are and prioritizing them, because they're different for everybody. And I threw some examples up here because obviously you want to focus on the more material items right away. But these are ones that just, I actually had some companies, these are actual examples where this first one, direct materials and outside purchases. This company thought that, well, what can I do about that? I'm buying these materials from the outside. I have no control over them. It is what it is. But we started looking at this company and I saw what was going on there, and they were off by 6 or 7%, and which is a huge number. And I said, we can't go any further because everything else that I want to measure below this area is going to be misleading because your value-added sales are off by a lot. So we dove into that first just to try to figure out what's going on there. And then we went further. Another company thought gross profit by customer, product type, and sale. A lot of you probably have reports like this, but for that company, they found some pretty eye-opening items. Cost study and pricing strategies, they go hand in hand. I'll talk more about that in a minute. This one is one of my favorites. Billing for freight, overtime, and change orders. Quick story on this one. It was a $7 million manufacturing company, pretty small, right? They put in place a policy that said no invoice can go out the door until the owner signs off on it or the chief operating officer. They'd never done that before. They kept track of this for 1 year, and the numbers that they picked up for extra billings that were going to be missed was almost $100,000. It was an average of $8,000 a month. And for a little company that's 7 million in sales, huge impact to their bottom line. And it was pretty simple. These would have actually been missed on the invoices to customers. So kind of fun what you find sometimes. Anyway, I say when you get in here and you start trying to identify these things, I always say keep a running list, right? Just keep a track of them, and it'll change over time, but it's nice to have that sitting on your desk. All right, let's get into our example. I picked labor costs. Surprise, surprise, right, Steve? This is something that Steve's heard me talk about a lot. Why did I pick labor? Because, well, it should be on everybody's list all the time. I mean, probably never comes off your list. And I've also made the statement that you can fix every other area in your company, but if you don't control labor, you're going to have a problem. I mean, so this should be number one. We've seen too many examples over the years of companies that don't manage their labor costs well. It's variable, it's controllable. If I had to change this one line, it says most underperforming companies have labor cost problems. I should have changed that to all, because I still haven't seen an example where that's not the case. And what do a lot of companies do when it comes to labor costs? They respond retroactively and oftentimes way too late. It's hard to convince them, first of all, that they have a problem. And by the time they go, oh, yeah, I guess we do. What do? They go back to the cut cost thing. They say, okay, we better get rid of some people, lay them off, cut their pay. That's a short-term fix, and that's not fixing the overall problem. So what are some of the things I hear when I sit down with clients and say, you know what, I think you have a labor problem, labor cost problem? They will say they're properly staffed, everyone's busy and needed. We don't have excess labor and can't get any leaner. One of my favorite lines is, they'll say, Mel, I'll tell you what, next time somebody leaves, we won't replace them. I go, wait a second here, aren't you kind of admitting you got a problem? Yeah, we do, but we don't like to deal with it, right? Nobody likes to deal with labor costs because it's, well, they're your family, your people, you know them really well. And I'm not talking about getting rid of people, that's a different topic. The numbers don't lie is kind of my thing, that if I see that on your financial statements you have a problem and you're exceeding your targets, you can't argue that. You can argue where the problem exists, but first of all, that's where I go to first. And I say, well, look at the number. I'll show you in a minute here. So one thing I like to do, I've done this many times, and you might think about this as something, maybe you've done it too, but, and by the way, you can do this for almost any significant cost item in your company, but we're talking about labor right now, is a 5 to 10 year correlation analysis. And I started doing this because I was having trouble getting the attention of one of my clients that they had a labor problem. And I went back, I think I did 10 years. Maybe some of you haven't been around that long, but you have a history, right? Go back and just simply, it's a simple analysis. It's, you know, what are your sales all those years? What's your value added? What's your total labor costs? And what's your profits? Just 4 things. And do a ratio and all those items. One thing to mention here is you need to normalize your earnings. Okay, so just, it can't just be bottom line profits. Normalize your earnings for those odd things, right? But if you had a large gain on the sale of fixed assets, take it out. Or if you had a large bad debt write-off, take it out. Get your profits normalized, but then you can run these numbers. And it's so interesting. It happens almost every time I do it, that you look back 10 years and you go, wow, we made really good money back then. And guess what? Our labor was right where it's supposed to be from a target number, a percentage. Oh, this year we lost money and labor's high. Imagine that. Or we broke even and labor's kind of in between. Or how about that year where you made really good money? We actually did better than the target. It's kind of an eye-opening deal. And after you get maybe a little bit better at it, you can even break this down further. Instead of total labor, maybe you're going to do this correlation analysis with what you think one of your problems is. Like if you think problem is overtime, you can't control overtime, do that. Just lay your overtime against these things and see what happens. The reason it's eye-opening and it gets people's attention, they look at that and they go, oh yeah, I think you're right. We got to get back to those numbers. So it's kind of fun to do. By the way, I think I said this already, but you can do this for any cost in your company, at least a significant cost, right? So you can do it for equipment or building costs or some other things that would have an impact on profitability. It's kind of interesting to play with. Okay, trust the numbers, they don't lie. So I just want to walk through some numbers. Now, this is a very simple example, right? I'm going to pretend we have a company with 7 million in value added sales. Say they're $11 million of gross sales. You hear me talk a lot about value added sales. I hope everybody knows what I mean there, but it's really your sales after your direct materials and outside purchases. It's what you have left to make a profit inside your company. I usually run both numbers just to see what it looks like off gross and value added. But anyway, for this particular company, let's say that historically they've been very consistent. They've been at 55% of value added sales. Okay, so what happens? Management has the perception that this is normal. Hey, we've been doing this 4 years in a row. We're pretty good. We're pretty consistent. This must be where we should be. And so what they're going to probably do is run next year's plan thinking, well, we got to hit that number again. But then you'd start digging into the research and analysis, or maybe that correlation analysis you did, and you realize, boy, when we were making money, we were actually at 51%. And by the way, I've got some good industry data here, and my competitors are at 51%. And you go, okay, we are consistent, but we're consistently bad. And that's not a good thing. So do the math. How big a problem do we have here? You run the numbers, throw some benefits in there, and it's about a $336,000 problem. Now, no one's that good that I can go to anybody and say, that's exactly your problem. But again, I can say with a lot of confidence, you've got a material problem here. I don't really know if it's 300,000, 400,000, whatever, but it's a pretty big item. And you think about a company of 7 million in VA sales, and what are they hoping for? Hopefully a $500,000 profit on the bottom line. It's a pretty big issue. And so again, all I'm doing here is trying to get owners or management to say, okay, you're right, we have a problem. Now what? And I'll say, well, I don't know yet. First objective was to convince you got a problem, but now we got to find the cause and effect. And that's the hard part. So flip over if you could, Lacey. So my experience with labor costs, and when I do this with clients, here's what they think. They think I'm going to now say, okay, you've got to fire 7 people and get rid of the $336,000. That's what they think I'm going to say. And I don't go there at all. I say, nope, it's not about cutting costs. It's about managing costs. And so we got to figure out what caused this problem. And that's hard. And my experience with labor is it's usually not one thing. It's usually several things. And you add them all up and you got a $336,000 problem. For example, it might be headcount, right? Maybe in my example, maybe we're overstaffed by 1 person. Okay. Pay rates. I've seen this. It's interesting. I have another client that they're 60 or 70 year business. They've been around a long time, successful, very loyal employee group. And what happens? We looked at it and they were on balance. They had way more older people than younger people, which I think a lot of companies are going through that right now. It's hard to find young people to come into manufacturing. And these older people, they were very good, but they kept getting their 3 or 4% every year. And all of a sudden you looked at it and you went, oh my God, they're 15% above market. That was causing some of this problem. Now you can't go back and say, hey, by the way, we're going to reduce your pay. I mean, you could, but what you can do going forward maybe is say, okay, we really got to work on getting some younger people in here because they're going to retire anyway. Or you know what, we can't give these people raises anymore. They're at the max now. Overtime controls. Again, one of my favorite areas. We had a company, a small machine shop not too long ago that we looked at this and we found this to be an area, just a short story here. We looked historically, their overtime hours in the course of like 3 years doubled per month. They went from like 450 to 900, but they were stagnant in sales. So anyway, that was getting away from them. And what I find a lot of times in companies on overtime is, even though you might think it looks okay overall. You probably do have some individual, what I call individual abusers in your company. They're good employees, but they get really, really good at turning 40 hours of work into 50. And you don't even notice it. You don't even see it. So overtime is an area you might find some things. How about pricing? Okay. How about my company that was 55% and of value added, right? And I go, okay, what about pricing? If we're not pricing our work right and value added is lower than it should be, what's going to happen to my labor numbers? They're going to look worse. And I've seen this many times where I go, yeah, you actually don't have a labor problem. You've got a pricing problem. So fix that, and all of a sudden your labor numbers are in line. Workflow efficiencies and equipment kind of go hand in hand there, right? Technology, you know, everybody's investing in technology to help keep labor costs down. One I don't have on here, but I just want to mention is that analysis of when do we outsource versus trying to bring work inside your shop. I mean, there's a labor component to that. And sometimes you should look at that maybe, you know what, maybe this area we should actually outsource, or maybe there's something we should bring back in. That's just another area to look at. So my point here is that when you start trying to figure out the cause and effect of your labor problem, it's probably going to be multiple areas. Okay. Yeah, just to highlight a couple things here that you need to do if you're going to take this on, besides the correlation analysis, of course, is figure out what your standards and targets are. Now, don't think this fits your company. I just kind of made these numbers up. You're going to have to figure this out for yourselves. And there's a couple ways to do it. One, and ideally, it'd be great to have, right, industry data and surveys from multiple companies to see what's happening out there, to see what your competitors are doing. There are a lot of good resources for that. But if you can't get your hands on that, do the correlation analysis, and you might identify your own target by just looking back at when we were really making money. And also, I like to do this and break it down between manufacturing, selling, and G&A, and do it based on value added and gross. So try to identify those numbers, and that's those targets you're going to try to manage to. Identifying what group of people are responsible. And this is the part where I talked about earlier. Don't forget about this. Okay, we established our targets, but now who's supposed to be responsible for this? Somebody in the plant's helping to drive manufacturing labor, right? And they're out there just trying to get their jobs out the door. And sometimes they have the mentality is, hey, I'm going to throw people at this because I got to meet this deadline. They don't think about costs and labor costs. But if you bring them back in and say, you know, this is part of your job, and here's the numbers we got to hit, and they'll say, well, how do I do that? You got to provide them reports and so forth. Determine and establish the management controls. That's pretty hard because, okay, we've identified the problem. We've identified the areas, the cause and effect. Now what do we do? Like the overtime example I gave you. Okay, simple things like who approves overtime? You know, are we passing it on to the customer when we should? You know, customer calls on Friday and says, I need this by Monday. You throw a bunch of people on it over the weekend, you pay them overtime. Hey, the customer made me do that. Why aren't I billing them for that? I mean, things like that. Just policies to put in place to help you control these things. How are we doing on time? Okay. I'll keep that in mind and maybe try to fly through some of these slides. I just wanted to go back, and that example we just talked about. Now let's go back to what I, listed as those problem areas within companies of why they can't get their arms around costs. Financial statements. Okay. If this is the ultimate, I call it the ultimate report card, right? You pick it up, It tells you how you did. And again, with respect to labor, do the financial statements actually quickly show this? It should. And this is where I said I've seen too many examples where people say, can you analyze our financials or our labor costs? And I look at them and I go, oh my God, I got to start pulling things from different areas and put them in the right buckets. And sometimes things are grouped together. Sometimes you don't have people on the right lines. So you got to make sure that they're easy to read, easy to use. And if they're not, you'll probably never really identify that, oh yeah, we do have a labor problem, because it just gets buried in all the minutia. Projections. This is your plan. So if it's your plan, as good as financial statements are, and they're informational, but they're history, right? It's a little bit like who cares, but it does help us show us where our problems are. But the projections are our future. So that's why I call it the most important tool. This is what we want to happen. So think about my example. If they were at 55% for 4 straight years, what happens often is you put together your budget and you go 55%. That's what we're going to do next year. But we just proved that it was wrong. We need to be at 51. That doesn't mean that, okay, we're going to start out January at 51%. It doesn't automatically happen, but your projections are your time where you build a plan and you say, how are we going to get from 55% to 51? And maybe whatever you decide is your plan, maybe in your projections, you say, you know what, by mid-year, by July, we need to be at 51%. And here's how we're going to get there. Management reporting. Do the people responsible have the tools which allow them to be proactive? And of course, communication expectations. I want to jump in. I think you get the feel that I'm focused on these things, and I've got more to talk about on these. So I'm trying to be cognizant of the time here too. All right. A little bit more about these 3 big areas. I call financial statements the most underutilized tool in most companies. I call projections the most important tool. I've already said that. And management reporting the most overlooked tool. And this is just from my experience dealing with hundreds of companies over the years. So think about this inside your company. This is the part where I think people don't like change. They think they're doing everything really well. I mean, I've suggested many times to change format of people's financial statements, and they really don't want to do it because it's a lot of work and they're used to looking at what they're looking at. But format is a big deal. It has to be laid out right. Anybody should be able to pick up your financial statement and, what I say, read it in less than an hour and interpret what it means. Who gets them? Who gets your financial statements in your company? Now, I know this is a little bit sensitive. I'm more of an advocate of sharing information, but you don't have to give the plant foreman the whole financial statement where he can see everything, but maybe you need to give him pieces of it, at least the pieces that you're asking him to control, or some reports off that. And how are they used? Going back to, okay, we got our financial statements, we sit in our management meeting. You know what happens most of the time? People look, first of all, your eyes go right to sales. Hey, what were our sales last month? Oh, good. And then they go to the bottom line. Hey, did we make money or not? Oh, shoot, we were a little off there. They don't really talk about much in between. And I'm not saying this applies to all you, but I see this a lot. And then they totally ignore the balance sheet. They don't even talk about it. And the balance sheet is equally as important as the income statement. You can argue with me about that, but I really believe that. It's the health of your company. And there's just not enough use of the financial statements. You're kind of almost moving on to getting next month's closed out, and you're not even working with what you just did. So how and who interprets them? Just the point here I want to make. The CFO, controller, who's ever putting it together, to me, they should also be preparing a short report. And when I say short, I'm going to say a page to 2 pages tops of just a write-up of what they say. Because it's, to me, it's their job not to just prepare them, but it's their job to interpret them and then convey what they think to the management. And you're really trying to answer their questions before they ask them. And it's your chance as a CFO and controller to actually have some input. And you can say, you know, boy, we did really well in this area last month or year to date. Boy, I think we have some issues here that we should dive into further. If that's not being driven by the CFO and controller, they're probably not being used the way they should, because everybody else just kind of looks at the things I just mentioned. And do they drive questions or concerns or observations? If they're not, you're not using the tool. It's a great tool. It's where everything starts. Projections. If this is the most important tool and you agree with me on that, shouldn't it get the most attention? Makes sense, right? But what do I see? I see people that hurry up to get their projection done because the bank asked for them or whatever, and you throw it together quick. You look at last year's numbers, you add 4% for inflation and whatever, and you say, here's my numbers. And then they go in a drawer, and then they're never talked about again. That's the worst case example, but these should be used every month. This is the most important tool. These should probably be scrutinized harder than your financial statements. This is your plan, right? Again, this is what you expect to happen. A couple points here. I'm a real proponent of, number one, every line item should have an assumption. It shouldn't just be, this is what it was last year. Whoever puts these together, they should know what's in there and they should build an assumption behind it. Number two, I'm a believer in a zero-based approach. What does that mean? It means not what it was, but what it should be, okay? So you use history for information, but that doesn't necessarily mean that should be our plan. We got to think about what it should be. Like my labor example, right? What it's been is 55%, but it should be 51. So process and use are the key here. We also in our company oftentimes do, and we did this last year, especially with COVID, because no one knew what was going on in April, right? We were just kind of going, oh my God. So we did like a worst case projection that said, well, what if the bottom falls out here? We did a most realistic projection, and then we did the what we call the upside projection. Kind of nice to have all those tools available. Management reporting, most overlooked tool. For the sake of time, because I'm going to talk more about this, jump to the next slide. This is my made up definition of management reporting. So I'll just read it to you. Anything that provides meaningful and useful information to aid in running the day-to-day operations as well as long-term planning. Management reporting, good or bad, because I've seen bad too, influences the way a business is managed and serves as a basis for decision making. That's what I think management reporting is. By the way, when we've gone into some companies to start looking at all their management reporting, and by the, with our today's technology, you can produce just about any report you want. First thing you maybe want to do is look at all the reports your company is generating and probably ask yourself if we still need it. So let's eliminate the junk first and then start creating the good reports. Because I've literally seen companies that just keep making more and more reports. They never get used, and so on. So what did I do here? These next few slides, by the way, I'm not going to walk through every line, but I just jotted down some ideas for you to think about for your company. I'm guessing a lot of you have maybe several of these already. And I didn't make all these up. I actually took these from many of our clients as ideas and ones that I thought were really good. You'll notice I have some sales related ones here, and you might think, well, Mel, I thought you said this isn't about sales. Yeah, okay, it's make a profit on the sales you have, but I still want to drive sales and I want to grow. So I still want to focus on some things related to sales, a lot of things. So these are just some reports again I've seen. Couple top account strategy. We all have top accounts, right? It's kind of simple, but what's our strategy next year for these top 10 accounts? How about substandard accounts? We all have those too. Sometimes less sales, more profits. I'm not saying fire your customers. First thing you should do is try to make them profitable, but if you can't, I would fire them. Direct materials, we talked about that a minute ago. Don't forget about this area, even though it's an outside cost. Again, remember that company that was 6 or 7% off? I mean, a 1 to 2% pickup here is huge. So there's some things you can do in there. Go to the next slide, please, because 849, okay. Cost rates and pricing, I put these two together because to me, they do go hand in hand. When's the last time you've updated your burden rates or cost rates? Ideally, you should do it every year. I see a lot of companies that haven't done it for several years and they think, well, who cares? The market dictates what we can sell it for. We're going to focus on that. People think they are pricing their work at market. Oftentimes they're not, and they're too afraid to increase prices because they're afraid of losing work. But if you ran through a cost rate study the way you should, I've always said it's one of the most educational things you can do in your company for the people that get involved with it, because you really start to understand what it costs to do anything in your company. So it's a great exercise for that reason, if you do it right. I'm not advocating this as an accountant that I want your working process to be right. It's more about what you're going to learn from it. And it does tie directly into pricing. Labor, we've already talked about enough, I think. So let's move on. Oh, one of my favorite areas again, manufacturing supplies. What are you talking about there, Mel? What kind of reports? I just say every once in a while, take a look at what's in this account. I call it the dumping ground. Why is it the dumping ground? Because when your accounting people don't know where to record something, they dump it in here. And all of a sudden you go in there and there's all kinds of things in there and you're going to be surprised. Repairs and maintenance, freight. Okay, we talked about that a little bit. Just making sure freight for many people should be a profit center. It's one of the first things I look at when I analyze the financials, like where's your freight cost? Where's your freight billing? Is it a profit center? Are you actually making money on freight? It shouldn't be a lot, but it shouldn't be a loss either. And too many people think they have good policies in place, but then you think about it, well, you get that job done, you get it out the door, you ship it to the customer, you send an invoice. 3 weeks later, the freight bill comes in and you go, oh, forgot about that. So be careful with that area. Alterations and change orders. Remember that little $7 million company that I told you picked up $8,000 a month in income just by doing this? Another good report to think about is utilization. Now, I think you probably have this in your company. If not, you should, but are you using it? I don't know. These are the 3 biggest cost areas of probably any manufacturing plant. It's the building, your facility, the equipment, and labor, right? And you know what your utilization target should be. Probably the biggest thing keeping people from profitability is, right, excess capacity. You just don't have enough to fill all this cost. So labor, what should your people be utilized at? The charge rate, right? I think for most manufacturing direct labor people, it's somewhere in the 75 to 85% area of a charge rate. Equipment utilization. Okay, we've got this expensive equipment out in the plant. How are we running it enough? I mean, that goes back to sales, right? My point here is that a lot of people look at facility and equipment and tell me, well, Mel, that's a fixed cost. I can't do anything about that. And my response, a little bit sarcastically as well, it's fixed until you unfix it. So I don't really believe in fixed costs. I mean, it's hard. Those are hard areas to deal with, but you still got to look at it. Spoilage, great one. Always hard to decide, is it spoilage or normal waste, right? So if you can identify what true spoilage is and you can improve that, that part, boom, drops to the bottom line. Then I started getting into some balance sheet items here because I don't want you to forget about the balance sheet. Remember, I said it's just as important. You can go forward. Okay, this one, cash flow. I have talked about this in previous presentations about a 13 rolling week cash flow schedule. We have a good template if anybody wants to see it, but it's a great tool. It's, you know, every week you got to update it, but once you get good at it, it's really not that hard. I mean, you'll get so used to it, it'll take you probably 15 minutes. It's just an awesome tool to be able to look at any one point in time what your cash looks like for the next 13 weeks. It's not going to be exact, but it'll show you if you're going to have a problem or not. A lot of people use I've had a lot of clients say, boy, that I used that a lot when I was having cash flow problems. Now I don't, but I still use it. What are some other good ones here? Oh, this one, kind of interesting, job assessment committee. I picked that up from one of our clients and I said, what is that? What are you doing? And they said, well, we've got 3 or 4 people that once a month they sit down, they pick a half dozen jobs to just sit down and talk about. And, you know, they talk about them for an hour, hour and a half. And they said they've picked up so many interesting things by looking at different jobs. Kind of an interesting one. I guess one of the points here is just, again, to keep a running list, right? Whatever it is the overwhelming part, keep a running list of these things you want to try to improve. And all these ideas here, again, are just ideas for different management reports. Go forward one more. A few more. One I want to mention here is company valuation. Again, remember when I said the 2 most important things are adequate profits and enhancing the value of the business? So do you have a report that's telling you if you're driving value? I do see more and more people tracking EBITDA, which is great, but understanding what drives value and are we enhancing the value of the business? And as an owner, if you think, well, geez, if the value of my business isn't going up, or if we're not headed that way, or if we're not driven that way, maybe I should get out and sell the business. Ratios, there's a million ratios out there. Just one caution is make sure you understand the ratio. I've seen a lot of people, they'll do the calculation and then they step back and go, yeah, I don't know if that's good or bad. You know, sometimes the ratio goes up, but that's a bad thing, or it goes down and it's a good thing, and just understand what you're looking at there. Okay. Ooh, I can go a few more minutes. Okay. I'm almost done. But as much as I've been talking about cost controls and making a profit on the sales you have, again, I'm very much an advocate for sales. So I didn't want to say nothing about sales. So again, same philosophy as the costs. You can dive into these areas and start to build some initiatives. Go to the next slide because I got a little bit more on this. Still trying to maintain strategies to grow and increase sales. It's not only about minimizing costs, managing the cost based on the sales you have. That's been the premise of this talk, right? But as you're doing that, you got to think about this next part, taking into account any strategic investments you're making, right? So if you're analyzing, a good example today is maybe labor costs. If you're analyzing labor costs and I say, well, geez, your labor costs are too high. And you'd say, well, yeah, but I'm making a strategic investment because it's so hard to find people today. And I've trained these people and I know we don't have enough sales, but I'm going to keep them. And I say, okay, as long as you're making a conscious decision and you factor that in, but keep asking yourself, are you healthy enough to do that? And can you afford it? Because at some point you can't. Same thing with acquisitions, right? That's a big thing today that people, organic growth is hard. So people say, well, we got to acquire another company. There's a big cost to that. Just looking, there's a cost to it. Buying a company, obviously, there's a cost to it. Purchasing new equipment, right? Cost justification. Yeah, you buy that new piece of equipment, you're not going to have profits overnight. So my point here is it's okay to invest in sales. I'm all for that. Just make sure you're keeping an eye on it, because one more client example, this company, I think, was doing it for almost 7 years, that they thought they were on the cusp of something huge, and they state-of-the-art thing they were developing. And they kept the core business did very well, and they could afford it. But every year they could afford it less and less because they were losing money on this other thing. And finally they did dump it, and they probably dumped it 3 years too late. But anyway, be careful with it because it can be a little dangerous. Yeah, just to wrap up, this is just kind of for you to think about. The only point I'll make on this, if you think, yeah, I'm going to bring this back and I am going to think about that question, are we as good as we think we are, and could we do something different, and should we implement some of these things Mel's talking about? You do need commitment from the top leadership. You need a committee or a facilitator that's going to drive it. What I've said about this is it's management's job, I think, to identify these problems and issues. I think it's their job to educate the people. Remember, I talked about that, on what it all means, and provide them the tools. And then, of course, it's management's job to hold them accountable. But then it's the people's job, I think, to get it all done. And so that's the point of all this, to work hand in hand with everybody. And it works. One more slide. This is just a summary of what we've talked about. So every company has tremendous opportunity for profit improvement on what they have. I really believe that. Any company I walk into, I'll say, you already have enough sales to make a profit. So take that position. Continue efforts to grow, but this should not be your primary initiative to improve profitability, okay? No magic answers. It's really not easy, but here's one I want to emphasize a little bit. When I look at owners of companies and I go, man, these guys are risk takers, they're entrepreneurs, they're not afraid to invest in $1 million pieces of equipment, to buy buildings, to hire all these people. And I'm saying, why wouldn't you invest in this process? I mean, first of all, it's not super costly, but the point is everything you do in business is an investment. But I'm just saying, geez, with all these millions of dollars you're investing and risking, why wouldn't you invest in this? And it's a continual process. I forgot to mention that part, that you're never done. You might think, well, how long does it take to do this? And I'm just going to say, you're never done. You just keep going. But ultimately, if you do get this in place and you get your people bought in and you're training them and they all kind of are on the same page with this, it actually does kind of become part of your culture. So it does work. So that's all I had, and I'm only 2 minutes over. Thank you. I don't know if there was any questions, or Steve, what?
Let the age-old question I probably asked. Just saying this is a loaded question. We've got so many shops that are job shops that, you know, just sort of head and load on sales and flying for talent and
Right.
So I know there's no easy answer to say, well, you know, you got a roller coaster, you know, your revenue throughout the year. You don't say, okay, well, we're not going to cut to try and get profitability to the bottom side because you just can't cut enough.
Right.
And we can't always manage the top side, so maybe managing overtime tightly. But as far as timing goes, whether it be the timing of labor or now too, some of the COVID results were material issues. How do you think you plan for that timing as far as, okay, we keep it as tight as we can so we can't you know, we can't be cutting adding.
No, I don't think you can. Yeah, I guess it maybe goes back to one of my recent slides here about investing. You know, that's a part where you don't want to let go of people, right? You got to keep them on board. So you're consciously investing and knowing your costs are too high. And I think that's just a decision you got to make. And as I said, if you can afford it, okay, you just got to suck it up and say, I'm gonna keep doing this. But there does come a point where you can't too. Maybe you're you run out of cash or you can't afford it anymore. I mean, there are some things I've seen people do with scheduling even. It may sound kind of basic, but I had this one company that had a lot of this ups and downs, didn't really want to let go of anybody because they were all good. So they tried on every Friday, they tried to look at what their workload was for the next week. And they would say, okay, we're super busy next week. Everybody's on board 100%. We're going to run overtime the weekend. Then some Friday they might go, geez, it looks pretty, low the next few weeks or the next week. And they might say, okay, people, 32 hours next week or something, you try to manage it that way. I mean, it's not ideal for people, but if you tell them ahead of time that over the course of the year, maybe they're still going to come out the same. It's just, we got to manage our cash better. I don't know, just some quick thoughts. But I understand. I almost hesitated in changing my labor analysis because in today's world, it is hard to find people. And I didn't want to say that you got to keep it down because I understand that issue right now.
Give them the free reign, they'll take the hours they're given, and we have a lot of success when we started having management watch the hours and creatively now too, especially if you get home where you got some people want 55 hours, some people don't want to work over 40.
Right.
Things like that. But yeah, if you just let it go for drain,
You can't do that because the overtime thing will kill you. And like I said, I'm guessing every one of your companies has people that do abuse it a little bit. That's a strong word, but they're so used to a paycheck that you think, boy, they're a really good employee. They're here all the time. They're working hard, but yeah, they're probably there for the check too, the overtime money. Anything else? Well, like I said, I hope it's helpful. There's not a lot of specific magic answers, but I hope you can take some of the things back and just think about how you do things in your company and maybe try to implement some of these things. So thank you.
thanks everyone for being here. We'll see you again soon.